Well, congratulations. You have purchased raw land, or you are considering purchasing raw land, and now you are faced with what to do in order to move on to your land. Obviously, raw land indicates that there's really nothing built on it. It's really working from the ground up. Moving into a house immediately on a homestead is great, but that involves more upfront expense, and maybe you didn't really want to do that because you wanted to start your homestead from scratch just the way you want it. I'm going to list some of the ideas that you can do in order to move on to your raw land, and I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of what we did, which is moving a camper onto our property and cash flowing the build of a house. Number one option is moving into a tent. I actually know at least 3 families personally off the top of my head who did move into, well, 4 now that I think about it, did move into a tent of some kind for 6 months or more. You actually could have a really comfortable setup this way. Not talking about the cheapy, Walmart, flimsy kind of material tent. Most of these people have either a canvas tent or something of that nature. So it is more insulated, if you could even call it that, than the nylon material that you get just for $50. But you do have to have more of an expense. And you can make it really comfortable. I know a family who had a platform built for their canvas tent. They had a full-size queen or king bed in there. They had a wood stove, and really setting up with the wood stove is the best idea you can do because the last thing you want to do is be cold. Another option, and this one is kind of if you had the money, you probably would have started this already, would be to build a little house or a cabin immediately and then move into that. I do know a family that built a very small, I would call it a shack, they call it a cabin, perspective. It's a very small, rough build, but they were living their dream. They did what they wanted to. They had no debt. They had no issues. Obviously, this was an off-grid build, and they still have that little shed or tiny cabin as a place for storage. So it doesn't necessarily need to be your permanent home that you build in order to move onto the property. Another option is buying one of those shed to house conversions or a mobile home. Basically, it's the idea of buying a pre-made thing and having it moved onto your property. And finally, what you can do is what we are doing, as you can see, buying a camper and moving it onto your property to live in until you build a house. Now, please do note, this is my experience. It might not be yours. This is my experience as a big family in an old camper. So keep that in mind. The pros. It is mobile, which is great because if you put it in the spot that you want to build a house eventually, you can pull it to the side and then build the house, and you can still live in the camper while you are doing your home. You can resell it. It's temporary. Most have an air conditioning unit or heat of some kind. It's got the same amenities as a house, like a kitchen, a bedroom, an eating area, a bathroom, etc. It is more child-friendly than a tent. So I'm thinking like CPS, Child Protective Services, or whatever the local, whatever it's called, people in your area are. You do have to consider that you're living an alternative lifestyle and the governing bodies aren't always familiar with what you're doing and what's going on. And if anything happens with one of your children, I know somebody whose child was playing on a bale of hay and rolling over it, and she fell and broke her collarbone. Well, when her father brought her into the emergency room, they really were looking at the father like, why does she have a broken collarbone? And he had her explain, I was playing with my siblings and my friends on a bale of hay and I fell off and hurt myself. But could you imagine, and we do have other friends who've had CPS due to another accidental injury come to their property, and that family was living on a platform, a wooden platform, with one of those outdoor garage kind of, it's like a tent but it didn't have walls. I think it had tarp walls, and it was pretty rough. It was temporary because they were building their home, but it still was something that I think is not as helpful to the family when you have the local authorities questioning, are you a competent parent? Which is really unfortunate. I'm glad that the resources are there because we do need to protect children who are not being protected by their parents, but a lot of us are just living alternative lifestyles. We're keeping our kids fed and warm and safe, and accidents happen, broken bones happen, and you don't want to have the extra strike against you that you are in a very rough situation. So those are things to consider, as well as the socially acceptable part. Campers are more socially acceptable than, telling your family, yeah, I'm moving me and the 6 kids into a tent, or me and the 11 kids. We know big families. And it is, I know most of you are probably like, yeah, forget what family says. But there's a lot of pressure, especially on women and moms, to, you're darned if you do and darned if you don't. You gotta be really thick-skinned. And finally, on my pros list, it is less expensive than building a house right away. You are buying time. That's very important, because the last thing you want to do is become desperate and make rash decisions, because when you are desperate, you make dumb decisions. And I will say that not every camper is less expensive. Somebody tried to sell my husband, when we were looking for campers, somebody tried selling him a used camper for like $50,000. No, don't. If you have the money, go for it. But no, no, we're not doing that. For a camper, not that I live in one, I certainly can tell you that's a bad plan. And now the cons. It is not meant to live in. Things will break. It is expensive to fix and replace parts. More expensive than a home sometimes. And I think that is because a camper is a luxury item. It's considered a luxury item. So everything is more costly to put in. It is not soundproof. And I learned this far after many sounds were made. And now my children are more familiar with the birds and the bees than I had anticipated they would be this early. It is small. There are different sizes depending on what you get. We do not have a fifth wheel. A fifth wheel will give you more vertical height. There are different shapes, different sizes, but ultimately it's a long rectangle. So there's really only one path that people can take back and forth. It is not really insulated very much. It is basically like a vehicle. When you get into your car in the summer, it is hot because it's a metal box. A camper is a metal box, so it gets extremely hot, even with air conditioning in the summer, and our door freezes shut in the winter when on really cold days, not all the time. And our windows do condensate, which you might have this in a house as well with single pane windows. They do condensate, they do freeze around the window, and it does drain down a lot of water that has caused water damage on the walls below the windows. Mildew issues. It is flammable. The materials are very flammable. The camper shakes with movement. See the birds and the bees comment from before. Everything is tiny. The kitchen sink, the oven, the bathtub and shower, and so on. It has very limited storage, so you will need to plan and have a shed or an outbuilding of some kind if you want to protect your items. And little food storage. That does go along with little storage, but I think it deserves its own point, because if you are homesteading, you're probably kind of more prepper minded, and really the most important thing you could have is food. Yes, a savings account as well, an emergency fund with liquid cash, that's very important. I think it's also important to have some precious metals, but food is really number one priority of having at least a 6-month rotation of food that you have on hand at all times. And we do not have that because we have such limited space. And anything we put outside is going to be exposed to the heat. The cold is not so much of an issue. It's really more of the extreme heat. It gets dirty very quickly because it's a small space. And surprisingly, things get lost really easily. And this last part goes with the luxury item category. I don't know how it is for you, but we do get taxed a lot more for our camper than I would think is necessary. I think our tax bill it's $200, but I don't remember if it's closer to $300 or more like $250. But we do have over $200 a year we have to pay for the luxury of owning a camper. Now, just because my list of cons was way longer than my list of pros does not mean that living in a camper on a homestead is not right for you. I still would say that I am glad we made this move because it took us out of a very bad rental house and into our property. And what better thing is that? I get to see the sunrise and I get to see how the land is and get a feel for it and just really see what I like, what I don't like. And I think that is invaluable. So that is my list of pros and cons of living in a camper on a homestead. And again, it might be the right thing for you, it might not. Maybe the things I listed previously, like a tent, a shed to house, a small cabin build, whatever, maybe those things would be more fitting for you. Now, if you have any experiences in a camper or in any of those things that I listed and you want to share those below, pros or cons, absolutely, please do share them below so that other people can get an idea as to maybe what would work for them. And I am way too far across the table from the camera to do the hand thing, so goodbye.